Hello everyone, my name is Michael Hare. Welcome to another episode of Flying with Friends, the first 50 years. The idea behind the series is that I want to share with you stories of just some of my amazing friends that are like awesome pilots and more importantly, awesome friends, but also people who have influenced me. And you could easily say that in chronological order, this would be episode number 1 because it's a story about my dad. So a surprising thing about my dad is that he died 4 years before I took my first flight. So he never knew that I became a pilot. But I didn't know it, but he influenced me greatly in that direction. And the way that the chain was broken and there was a gap between when he passed and when I started flying, it's kind of a miracle that all of this happened. So what I want to do is, best I can, try to cover this story of kind of my whole life, but I'm going to squeeze out a lot of it and just try to hit some high points. So my dad passes away. Years later, I joined the Air Force. 33 years later, my mother passes away. My siblings and I now are grieving our mom, cleaning out the house, distributing literally everything that's in the house. We're going to sell it. Nobody wants to keep the house. So way in the back closet at the end of the hallway, we called it the linen closet. At the very bottom of that is this briefcase, and none of us could read. When we dug down to it and we got to this briefcase, we're all kind of looking at it like, oh, what's this? I wonder what's inside. Well, you open it up and it's a treasure chest of aviation history, of stuff that my dad worked on for his entire career until he passed away. So it would be impossible for me to cover everything in here because it's literally crammed full of really, really cool stuff. So I've gone through and I've picked out some things, highlights along the way of projects that my dad worked on. And I'm going to start with, he was a engineer, technical guy working for Douglas Aircraft Corporation. And one of the earliest pictures I could find is the F3H Demon, which when you look at some of the things on this airplane, it was just an ugly airplane. It was funny looking, but here it is, a group of guys working on the airplane. My dad is right here, and if you look at it and study some of the details, it's an odd airplane. And then some of the sources I looked at trying to find more information about this airplane is that they said the F3H Demon was the father to the F4 Phantom. So I don't recall that my dad ever worked directly on the Phantom, but based on this photo here and the next one as well, my dad's in this picture in front of an F-101 Voodoo with a little sign up here that says 200 hours. So my imagination says that this is a test article. They got 200 hours on it, and they're celebrating that kind of milestone. So here's another picture of the F-101 Voodoo without any workmen in front of it. So that was another project that my dad worked on. So from there, he skipped over, and I don't know exactly how this works, if he was an employee doing contract stuff, just out on the range, NavCom, telemetry, that kind of thing. But he got wrapped up in a project called the X-15. And here's a picture of the X-15 with a fellow by the name of Neil Armstrong, who you may have heard of in other space adventures. And then here's a picture. I'm sure my mother hates this one. This is my dad drinking a beer with Scott Crossfield. And if you zoom in on that picture, you can just, at least I see the admiration in my father's eyes, getting to share a beer with Scott Crossfield, who's another pretty amazing person in our aviation history. This one's a little bit hard to see, but all of that stuff happened in the middle of the night, loading up the rocket fuel into this rocket airplane and hanging it on a B-52 to get off early in the morning before it got too hot to get these sorties done. So that's just a picture in the middle of the night loading the airplane. Here's a magazine from Skyline, which is, the entire magazine is about the back shops that kept the X-15 going. the laboratories and the people that did all these, I'm going to use the word mundane jobs that were absolutely necessary to get this airplane flying. So another project that was going on at the same time towards the end of our time at Edwards before we moved to New Mexico, there was another supersonic project called the XB-70 Valkyrie, which is only a Mach 3 airplane, 70,000 foot airplane, remarkable. They built 3, crashed 1, kind of canceled the program, but my dad was part of that project for a time. So then things are changing. We've been at Edwards Air Force Base. Now we're moving to White Sands Missile Range, where my dad is getting more and more involved with computers. So if you look at this room-sized computer, my guess is if we knew the details of that computer, it probably is as smart as my iPhone now that I carry around in my pocket, but that was kind of the state of computation at the time. So then we moved, after a couple of years at Las Cruces, New Mexico, working on the range at White Sands, we moved to Florida in 1966, where the big news there is Gemini and then Apollo. So my dad went from working on the flight line to working on in the control room, and he was monitoring a screen and sharing with the rest of the team status of nav or comm, or I don't know exactly what was happening on his console, but he was one of the guys in the room there. So he was there for Gemini, Apollo. Exciting times. When I think back about being a young teenage kid, 13, 15 years old, my dad was going out to the Space Center every day, and he was part of these programs. So there's so much history. The loss of the crew in Apollo 1. I remember that night at a basketball game in high school, and we heard about the fire and walked outside, and right there, looking across the Indian River, you could see the gantry there, and it was just hard to imagine that we just lost 3 of our finest astronauts. And my dad, I just remember him coming home and being devastated in the impact that it had on that program. So we as a nation recovered from that. We put Neil on the moon and did all of the steps to get to the moon and back again. And what an incredible program when you look back on it. And things like, here's my dad's certificate of participation for Apollo 11 going to the moon, which I think is pretty cool. Here's another letter that I just absolutely adore. March 17th, 1965, the original auto pen, but my dad has a letter from NASA signed by all of the Apollo astronauts, thanking him for his contributions to the program. Another kind of a cross circle thing is the Earthrise picture taken by astronaut Bill Anders on Apollo 8. And I have always loved this picture. Well, it turns out decades later, my good Air Force buddy Chip Long knows Bill Anders out on Orcas Island, and I didn't have a chance to meet Bill before he passed away, but I got to meet his widow and got to see kind of his place where he lived out there on Orcas after he had retired. So that picture to me is just, I just love that picture. So here's a picture of the Apollo 8 crew getting ready to go. So another thing that my dad did is, I love these things, these envelopes. Apparently, many of the employees out on the Space Center, on the day of a big significant launch, they would go out, they would address a letter to themselves, or in this case, my dad addressed the letter to me, and it would be postmarked from the Space Center on the day of a significant launched. So for example, here's July 16th, 1969, Kennedy Space Center postmark with the stamp, with the Earthrise stamp on it, addressed to me with that postmark. And then a couple days later, first man on the moon, postmarked July 20th, with the first man on the moon stamp addressed to me, which is just like and it's a 10-cent stamp. Beautiful, beautiful memories. So running parallel with all of this progress in space, my dad is getting sick. His kidneys are failing him, and Mom and I are using a dialysis machine 2 or 3 times a week to keep my dad alive. Well, it worked for a while. We got a couple extra years with him, but then he passed away, and the impact on me, it hit me hard. I look back on those days. It was really, really hard. And I got lost. I was just angry and depressed and couldn't understand why my dad had to die. My mom, everybody was worried about me because I was just self-destructive behavior, all kinds of silly things, dropping out of high school. So a couple of years later, my mother conspires with her friend to get me in front of an Air Force recruiter who was not very impressed with me. I had long shoulder-length hair, high school dropout, and he reluctantly agreed. He says, if you get a GED and if you take the battery of tests to get into the Air Force, we'll see what we could do for you, and we could maybe get you in 6 months or so. And I think what he was really hoping is that I would just go away and never come back. So I took the test. I got my GED. Well, it turns out I scored really high in every area. And when he got the test scores back, he said, you can have any job that you want. You're qualified for any of those jobs. So that could be a whole nother episode of how I got to go to Keesler Air Force Base for a year of air traffic control radar maintenance school, 49-week academic program at Keesler Air Force Base, where I got to go on my first flight, join the Aero Club, and became a private pilot before I went on to my first assignment at Myrtle Beach. So what I want to do is just acknowledge the influence that my father had on me in my flying career, even though he had been gone for several years before I flew. And then I also want to introduce 2 more names that I want to have episodes on later. One is Tom Forsyth, who was my first flight instructor. He's passed away. So I've done some research on him. You'll hear more about him in a subsequent episode. And another pilot who influenced me greatly, and I got introduced to him through Tom Forsyth at Myrtle Beach. And you might recognize his name, Brian Shull. He was a SR-71 pilot, A-10 pilot, and I considered him a friend of mine from my early days. So for now, thank you very much for being here today on this episode of Flying with Friends, the first 50 years. I think I've got some great episodes coming up for you. I look forward to seeing you again. Take care. Bye-bye.